It's quite exciting stuff when you look at it from a debate perspective, but it's really reality, and a lot of people are worried about the debt concerns. This time last year, we were worried about Greece. Now, Ireland is one of the big issues.
Yeah.
How important is the Eurozone at this point in time?
Well, very important, simply because it's a big economy, and it's South Africa's biggest trading partner. So whatever happens in Europe is certainly going to impact on the South African economy as well. But not only that. What happens to the dollar-euro, for instance, affects all sort of other things, like, for example, commodity prices, the exchange rate of our currency, bond prices even. So it's certainly impacting on globally, and we can see that markets globally are reacting to what's currently going on in Europe. And the interesting thing is, not too long ago, some economists were calling for parity between dollar and euro, and then all of a sudden they were quiet, because then they called for 160 dollar-euro, and now they're calling for parity again. So interesting to see what's going to happen.
Well, you know, looking at the euro, and of course a lot of countries are trying to depreciate their currency. There are a lot of concerns about a depreciating euro. Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, is concerned about the Eurozone's health, and of course looking at that euro quite extensively. What kind of risks are going to come to the fore when it comes to the euro?
Well, I think that in simple terms, what's going on in Europe is that you have a debt problem. In the case of Ireland, for example, it's a bank debt problem.
But the US also has debt problems. I mean, look at
but
what's
the
happening in
US,
California.
the US economy is the world's biggest economy, firstly, and secondly, the US economy is the world's most, or has the world's most important reserve currency. And this is not going to last forever. I think over time, and in fact it's already happening, that the reserve status of the US dollar is slowly being eroded. The Chinese recently started buying the loonie, for instance. They're even starting to diversify their own portfolios into things like, for example, won or the South Korean debt instruments. So what is certainly happening is that the dollar is still the dominant reserve currency in the world, but it is slowly being eroded. And whether we like the Americans or not, the US dollar is still seen as the safe haven. And that's the reason why the US dollar is getting stronger at the moment. I don't think equity markets are going to do that well for the next couple of weeks, perhaps, until we've sorted out this looming financial crisis.
Do you think that Ireland should be tapping into those emergency funds?
I think they are going to.
And do you think Portugal will?
And they will eventually as well. And they are talk even of the Italians, and maybe even the French having to take out or being bailed out because of their high debt levels. Yes, I think eventually what is going to happen, the Irish have been running their economy very conservatively, very well the last 20 years or so, and it's really unfortunate that this is happening to the Irish. Of course, it's not. Of course, it's a banking crisis, but in the end,
perpetuated by the property.
It's a debt problem.
That we
exactly the same what we saw in the United States, and to a much lesser extent in South Africa.
The end of the euro, Dawie. Many are still calling that perhaps you know, we could see some.
I think it's still early days.
Forward.
I don't think that is going to happen. I don't think we've got a financial crisis. The reason why I say so, it is a financial problem, but it's not a financial crisis, because we know the IMF or the ECB or the bigger economies in Europe are certainly going to bail out the Irish or the Portuguese if they get into trouble. But what's going to happen if one of those really big economies, like the Italians or maybe even the French, eventually start getting into trouble? Then, of course, the picture can change.
Well, can't they just print more money?
They can print more money. They have been printing some money in the past, but what they do need, those economies like, for example, the Greeks, they want their own currency, because if you have your own currency, you can devalue yourself out of troubles. They can't do that while they're part of the euro area. I think there's a lot of tension, at least in the euro area.
Quite interesting. I mean, looking at China, you know, there's worries about tightening. You saw inflation rate of 4.4%. Most were expecting 4%. That's from 3.6%. You've got all these numbers that you need to digest. Bank of Korea rising, hiking rates. Australia has been doing so for quite some time now. And then you've got austerity measures in the European Union, even though they don't have a lot of worries about the growth scenarios that are playing out, but a lot of differentiation occurring between deflation and inflation. Dawie, how's that going to impact South Africa?
I think South Africa's on a receiving end here. There's really very little that you can do about this. The Americans are printing money. The money must go somewhere. It's going to emerging economies like, for example, South Africa, and to Australia for that matter. I think we simply have to take it on the nose. The currency is going to remain fairly strong, relatively strong, and there's very little that we can do about this. I think we have to get used to a currency that's relatively strong, and a currency that may stay strong for quite some while.
Well, that said, Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan saying as quickly as the money came in, is as quickly as it can leave, and that was proven in 2008.
That's the big risk. We've got, we received close to 100 billion rand since the beginning of this year in hot money, mostly. Portfolio flows coming into the bond market and our equity market, but I still think our bond and equity markets are quite attractive for now. But the big risk really is if that money decides to leave the South African economy, suddenly we will have to deal with a currency that's significantly weaker. But I don't see that happening, at least not yet.
Former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan over the weekend saying that the US must reduce its debt mountain or risk a bond market crisis. We've been talking about a bond market crisis for some time. He's also been criticized for keeping interest rates far too low for way too long and, of course, perpetuating some of the issues that we're dealing with now. Yes,
well, I think he's part of the problem. He started this very loose monetary policy 20 years ago, and the result of that was this huge increase in debt burden in the United States. Alan Greenspan also said that if he comes back one day, he would like to come back as the bond market because everybody is scared of the bond market. The bond market is telling us that there's inflation expectations, bonds are going up, or the yields are going up in the United States, going up in Europe, and all sort of derivatives on the bond market are indicating that there could be some inflationary pressures, or at least expectations of inflationary pressures going forward. I'm not so sure that this QE or quantitative easing of the Americans are certainly necessarily going to help their economy to start employing more people. I think they're between a rock and a hard place.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask you. Is quantitative easing helping the end consumer, the people on the ground, or is it helping the investor community?
I think it's the gains at this stage have been mostly on the financial markets. It have been on equity prices worldwide. It certainly has been up to now on bond prices going up. I think that could be turning around. The Americans, either they're going to be successful and they will have inflation and that will lead to slow economic growth for a long period of time, I'm talking about 10 years, or they're not going to be successful and that will lead to slow economic growth for the next 10 years.
And I can't keep track of these commodity prices. We saw copper hitting, very close to $9,000 a ton. You've got gold hitting a new all-time high last week, 1,424, and now we're around 1,300. So you've got a lot of worries about tightening and consumption of these commodities, and then you've got the speculators sitting on the sidelines having fun.
Two factors. We've got the emerging economies, the Chinese still doing very well, pushing up commodity prices, including the South African economy, which I think will be doing a little bit better than what the Minister of Finance expects up to now. The other factor, of course, is the dollar itself. There are speculators saying, listen, the US dollar is going to fall in value over time. They're going to have inflation, and that's pushing up commodity prices as well. But I think you have to make a distinction between, let's call it normal commodities and gold. Gold, in a way, is a currency. In fact, there have been some calls that we should return back to the gold standard, and that's going to be a lot of fun. Of course,
Robert Zelek alluding to that. Chicago Mercantile Exchange raising margin requirements for gold by 5.9%, for silver by 11.5%, saying that perhaps some speculators are going to start liquidating their positions because now it's becoming more expensive to hold the yellow metal.
Yeah, they perhaps a little bit concerned about the volatility of those metal prices going forward. Of course, the more volatility, the higher the margins that you do require. So I think that's just a sign telling us that they think that the gold price or commodity prices perhaps are going to be very, very volatile. The gold price, for instance, you can't keep track of the gold price from day to day. You should look at the gold price over a longer period of time, and the gold price today is significantly higher in dollar terms than where it was a year ago. And that's a sign, I think, that the markets are getting a little bit concerned about possible inflation in the US economy.
Okay, well, Dawie, after all these issues that we've discussed, when you look into 2011, what exactly do you see in the crystal ball?
Pretty much the same as what we have at the moment. I think we're going to stagger from one crisis to the next in Europe, because we haven't seen the end of the crises in Europe. I think the emerging economies will continue to do pretty well. I think the South African economy will probably surprise to the upside. I think the South African economy will be doing pretty well, and I think the rand will remain fairly strong. And I'm not sure about our bond market, but I have got a suspicion the bond market may go down a couple of points still.